Thank you all so much for coming to what I am convinced is going to be a historic event. My name is Juan Battle. I'm a professor of sociology, public health, and urban education here at the Graduate Center. I'm also the director for Africana Studies. And I would like to actually first introduce a co-sponsor for this event. It's Africana Studies as well as CLAGS. And for that, the director of CLAGS. Please, Jim, come on up.
Good evening. As Juan said, my name is Jim Wilson, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies here at the Graduate Center. Let me just start by saying it has been an absolute joy working with Africana Studies on co-sponsoring this event. And this is an especial pleasure since all three of our honored guests tonight are very good friends of CLAGS. Urvashi is a Kessler Award winner, and both Dean and Rosamond are former CLAGS board members. Of course, CLAGS wouldn't exist without friends like these, the scholars, artists, activists who challenge, provoke, and inspire us. And without the generosity of our CLAGS members, we would not have opportunities like this to be challenged, inspired, and provoked. So if you are not already a member of CLAGS, we urge you to do so this evening. And if you are a member, we appreciate your commitment, and we hope that tonight you'll give a little bit more if you're so moved to. And if you haven't already, make sure that you pick up our Law C calendar, which is available outside, which has a list of our upcoming programs. We've got a major conference in April on homonationalism and pinkwashing. We'll continue our Performing Query series with Jill Dolan and Holly Hughes, and we have seminars, fellowships, and we do hope that you'll take advantage of our wonderful programs. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Juan, and our guests for being here this evening.
Two quick public service announcements. Number one, immediately following this, there'll be a reception with light, very light. So if you're hungry, go out. On the 6th floor of this building in the Sociology Lounge, which is room 6112, just sort of follow the crowd up there. The other thing, on your way out, please buy a book. These wonderful people have agreed to do this without an honorarium because I couldn't find enough money. So the compromise, please buy a book, Ain't Nothing in Life Free. So this came about because about a couple months ago, it seems to me, there was a dinner. And at the dinner, we were discussing Dean's book, and Urvashi was there, and it's a part of a book group that Rosamond is also a part of. And I sat at that dinner, and as I said, I don't necessarily agree with everything Dean says. I don't agree with everything Urvashi says, but I like the way they say it. And I said, this merits a larger audience, and we've got to make that happen. And that's what this is here this evening. And to introduce these two powerful people is another powerful person, Rosamond Keen, who is a critical and creative writer, performer, and artist. Google her. Her scholarly work focuses on sexuality in the Caribbean and Africa, and her book, Island Bodies, Transgressive Sexualities in the Caribbean Imagination, is forthcoming from University of Florida Press. She's a former board member of CLAGS and the Audre Lorde Project. King is currently the co-chair of the Caribbean IRN and a 2013 Poets House Fellow. She teaches English at Brooklyn College. Please help me in welcoming Professor King.
We're all incredibly excited. A lot of you know that the room actually had to be moved because very quickly the RSVPs filled up the space that we were going to have, which is pretty but not big enough for the personalities and the intellects that we have here this evening. So I'm very pleased to introduce our two speakers for tonight. I'm going to introduce both of them, and then I'll tell you the format they'll both speak, and then we'll have a conversation. Urvashi Vaid is the director of the Engaging Tradition Project at the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia Law School. She's the author, of course, of Irresistible Revolution, Confronting Race, Class, and the Assumptions of LGBT Politics, as well as Virtual Equality, which many people have read, the mainstreaming of gay and lesbian liberation. Vaid was executive director of the Arcus Foundation Deputy Director of Governance and Civil Society at the Ford Foundation, and former Executive Director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. She's also a blogger at urvashi.net. And I'll tell you I'll tantalize you if you haven't read the books yet. One of the titles of a chapter in her book is, "We're Dykes, Don't Touch Us." Dean Spade is an associate professor of law at Seattle University School of Law and a visiting scholar at Columbia Law School's Center for Gender and Sexuality Law. In 2002, Spade founded the incredible Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a nonprofit law collective that provides free legal services to transgender, intersex, and gender nonconforming low-income people and people of color. Spade, of course, is the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. And one of the titles of a chapter in his book is, "This is a Protest, Not a Parade." So what we're going to do now is Urvashi will speak first, and then Dean will speak, and they're going to speak briefly because all of us are really interested in the conversation that can happen amongst all of us. So get your questions ready, and then we'll have a dialogue with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosamond. It's really wonderful to have you facilitating, and thank you all for coming. Thank you to CLAGS, thank you to Dean. Those of you who are standing, there's 2 seats right here. Just come and take them, come on. And raise your hand if there's a seat next to you that's not taken, please. And so you see those hands, go there. Get comfortable. If you'd like to come up on stage and sit, you can. There's a lot of room. I'm serious. I mean, just get comfortable. I'm really excited about tonight because although Dean and I have known each other for 15 years, we have never had a public conversation. And we've had a lot of private conversations, and Dean's one of the most influential people in my thinking and activism ever since the moment I met him. When Dean was 20 and I was 40. That's when we met, 15 years ago. So we're going to talk briefly about each of our books in outline form and then have a conversation. So this book is a critical look at the mainstream LGBT movement. That's what it's about, the mainstream LGBT movement. There are many different movements. There's a progressive grassroots movement, there's people of color movements, there's the academic universe, but this really looks at, the national, state, and local infrastructure of what might be characterized as a mainstream movement. Its politics, its infrastructure, its priorities, and the assumptions that underlie these. There's basically 4 assumptions that I talk about in different ways in the book. The first is the assumption that the mainstream movement makes about who is the subject of its activities, who is the subject of rights. And in my view, and in the view of many, this is expressed in who's the imagined subject of who we're working for. And the mainstream movement's imagined subject remains white, middle class, more often male than not, and gay. It's not a stated assumption of the mainstream movement, but this is expressed in the movement's politics through the absence of focus on issues affecting various kinds of people in different parts of our communities. There's an absence of focus on racism, on racial justice, on trans people's lives, on reproductive justice, on violence against women and trans people, on poor people's needs, on issues like jobs, homelessness, even healthcare, are less central concern to the queer mainstream movement today. The second assumption that the book takes up is sort of the assumption that the mainstream movement makes about whether it's pursuing redistributive strategies or recognition strategies. And it's my experience that the movement is pursuing primarily recognition approaches. We're here, we're queer, get used to it type of stuff, rather than shifting the distribution of power and resources in this country, if not around the world. It's not a movement that's focused on critiquing capitalism. It's not a movement that really talks about economic inequality in meaningful ways. It accepts it as something that is the job of some other movement to take up. A third assumption that the book talks about in sort of practical ways is the erasure and avoidance of race-based disparities or racial justice by this mainstream movement. This is illustrated in 1,001 ways in all of our experience with queer organizations, ranging from who is in the leadership to what agenda are pursued and what aren't pursued. I mean, the difficulty we had in adding immigrant rights to the agenda of mainstream organizations is an example of the kind of invisibility of race in the politics. We can talk more about that. I think the decrease of focus on HIV is another example of that kind of race politics. And I guess the final sort of assumption that the book grapples with is about what is the best way to pursue and achieve social change. And this is a point that Dean makes brilliantly in his book about the difference between a rule-shifting strategy and a strategy that's really more about changing the lived experience of people. And the movement strategy right now is primarily a rule-shifting strategy. It isn't even a culture-shifting strategy, and I'll talk a minute about that. So, I'm thrilled that the book came out. It was brought up by an independent press. He's here, Don Weezy, thank you. When I say he's here, I mean publisher, editor, bookseller, all in one, okay? Love small presses. But the book looks at these assumptions from several lenses, from the agenda of the movement, from the structure of organizations, the whole non-profitization of organizations, boards, staff, and vision, the financing of organizations in the mainstream movement, the impact of wealthy donors. Let me give you a little stat that I just read the other day. It's not in my book because the data just came out. There's a think tank called the Movement Advancement Project that studies the different sectors of the nonprofit infrastructure in the queer world. And you can get all their stuff at lgbtmap.org, Movement Advancement Project. They did this annual report roundup of the 40 largest advocacy-oriented queer groups. And there were, of those 40 organizations, in 2011, raised about $185 million. And only 279 people gave more than $25,000 to any of those 40 donations. So a lot of that money is coming from small donations, but a disproportionate share of that amount comes from a few large givers. What that means is that there's a disproportionate impact of a small number of wealthy donors. I know that from my own lived experience, working for 10 years in foundations. And I'm happy to talk about that. And the book talks about some of the contradictions of that and the class politics that arise from being in relationship to a small number of donors who control a lot of the agenda. I'm going to, because we're talking just for a short amount of time, this is a thumbnail sketch. You all know, or you may not know, I've worked in the movement for 35 years, which is about 105 in lesbian years. Right? I mean, it really is. 35 years. And when I say worked in the movement, I mean, when people like me and some of you in the room that I know so well, who've done it even longer than I have, when we started out, working in the movement meant just stuffing envelopes, organizing demos, doing, running meetings, volunteering while you did your job. And then I moved from working in those places to being on staffs of organizations, volunteering for boards, and now doing this weird placement of being in academia. Very weird. Very different. Wonderful. I mean, weird, wonderful. My political activism throughout this time has come from three places. A desire to change the material conditions of people's lives. Really, anti-capitalist politics was first for me. The second was the desire to change structures and systems that control us by race and gender. That came close second. And the third was a desire to create more participation and build movements to resist authoritarian and patriarchal control. Those are the three threads of my work. So the book and the politics that it expresses come from those places. And in my book, Virtual Equality, I argued three things. I argued that in order to advance, queer politics needed to place itself within a broader social justice framework, a racial, economic, gender justice framework. Second, I argued that the queer politics needed to expand its focus on the state level of work, not the state defined as the state, but federal, state, local, in that sense, in the states. And that we weren't doing that at the time that the book came out in '96 or in the early '90s. And the third argument was that we needed a politics that was focused on defeating the right wing morally and politically. And that we needed a politics, therefore, that encompassed something that was more than rule shifting. And I continue to believe those three things. And this book argues for a couple of additional interventions, which may or may not address the problems that it diagnoses. I'm very honest about, I'm not sure I offer remedies that are commensurate to the problem. But I do think that the remedy for the mainstream movement is a choice. Those of us who are working still inside of it to try to reform it, so that these massive infrastructures will not just be spinning into liberal nothingness, but actually be meaningful in their engagement with social justice. So there's a reformist approach that's recommended. And then there's also an approach of strengthening the alternative, which Dean and I argue back and forth about a lot. Not argue so much, but it's more of a both and. And I spin my wheels a lot in the rut of the mainstream movement. Don't ask, I don't know. Maybe there's some therapists who could help me. I'm willing to go there. The second thing that I clearly believe is that racism infuses every aspect of this country's structures. And you cannot proceed towards social justice without dealing with that. And we're not dealing with that. And so that's that. And the third is that no movement can survive into this next era that we're going in without some kind of approach towards the economy and capitalism. We're in a corporate capitalist state. It's becoming more and more authoritarian. It's going to become that way. It's a surveillance state. It's a military state. What do we do about it? How do we organize around that? And this whole emergent critique of homo-nationalism and pinkwashing articulates some of the directions we should go. This book is not coming from that place, but I feel like that's the path forward. Do you know what I mean? That's not, the analysis isn't in here. You find it in other people's work, including Dean's. Finally, I'll say that I continue to believe that there's three kinds of things that are needed to make social change for queer people and for all people. You do need rule shifting. You do need to change rules and laws. But you also need to change practices and how those laws are enforced, implemented, adjudicated, lived. But the third thing you need to change are norms, which are norms and traditions, which is what I'm trying to think about now in my work, such as it is. So rules, practices, and norms. If you can, a movement that focuses only on one of these misses a lot. Thanks.
Thanks so much to Juan for organizing us, and everyone at CLAGS and Activism Studies, and thanks so much to Rosamond for being our inquirer, and thanks for starting us off, and also for being such a long-time collaborator and I don't know. Juan used that word provocative, and I thought it was an interesting one. Anyway, we provoke each other a lot, interesting ways. Okay, so quick and dirty of that book. That feels like I wrote it like a million years ago, so it's hard to still do, but give it a shot. So this book is about critical trans politics. That's like this phrase I'm trying to use. And what I mean by that is trans politics that's racial and economic justice centered, and a trans politics that tries to avoid some of the traps that I think contemporary political conditions lay for populations resisting conditions of economic marginalization and state violence. So they're traps that are not just there for trans movements, they're also there for like lots of movements. And it's also a politics that I think is really critical of legal reform, because it sees the role of legal reform as one that stabilizes and preserves violent systems. It also sees how legal reforms or demands for law reform can shift movements away from demands for redistribution and dismantling apparatuses of state violence and towards demands for recognition, like Urvashi was saying, and being recognized by apparatuses of state violence. And these shifts often align these movements, like shift their alignment to be aligned with state interests and institutions that justify, shore up, and expand the very things that are harming these populations. That's like the really dense. So this work came from, this book came from my observations from working at SRLP as a poverty lawyer, working with transgender and performing intersex people. And in general, people who come to SRLP are facing like really high levels of homelessness, poverty, vulnerability, criminalization, and immigration enforcement, lots of police violence, lots of folks are locked up. So kind of seeing that range of things, seeing the ways that trans and gender conforming people experience employment discrimination, family rejection, exclusion from social services, and seeing also how a particular set of dilemmas that we face as people who are highly endangered inside gender segregated social services and punishment apparatuses, right? All the places where poor people and people of color are concentrated in our society are gender segregated. That's part of how they do their control of violence. And that's particularly dangerous in particular ways for trans and gender nonconforming people. And seeing in general how social services spaces and spaces that process poor people like prisons and jails and immigration, et cetera, are spaces of gender segregation and gender norm enforcement in lots of ways, including like the welfare office or the welfare job site, et cetera. So doing that work and seeing those things and finding out that, guess what, most people have no legal claims, right? Like most people have no winning legal claim despite the fact that they're experiencing this severe violence. Because even though we have these like civil rights laws and anti-discrimination laws in place, they don't actually reach the kinds of harm and violence that people that come to SRP are dealing with. It doesn't seem to matter that racism and sexism have been declared illegal, that because racialized gender violence is still alive and well, and it tends not to be reachable through the law reforms that are in place. So that's kind of it releases kind of dilemma for trans activists, right? And activists, I think, in all movements, who are seeking redress for marginalization of state violence, right? Because we live in a country where the story is, if you're a population facing all the stuff I just described, you should try to change the law. Right? And this is a really big story that we tell ourselves, we tell fifth graders, it's a story about how the way that the United States is like a right on redeemed place from our brutal, nightmarish, supposed history of racism, slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera, is that we've changed the law and now things are cool. And it's a really deeply intense, like anti-black story in the United States, that racism is over, that now everyone's on a level playing field, and the fact that some people have the worst jobs, have the worst poverty, the worst housing, the worst schools, the worst exposure to pollution, well, that's just must be because, right? So this is a very deep, intense story in the US, and it's more broadly, I think, a story not only about anti-black racism, although I think that's really a central point of it. It's told about any system. We're told that law reform has redeemed all the harsh and fucked up systems. Right? We're told that our immigration system was once, race-specific, and we had Asian exclusion laws, and we had quotas, and now that's all cleaned up, and now it's race-neutral, right? And we're told that our military has been reformed to include people of color and to let women serve in combat, to include lesbian gay people. So now it's like an anti-homophobic, anti-racist. Right, so this is a very deep story, like on so many levels, right? We could tell it about the Americans with Disabilities Act, we could tell about everything, right? And so we have this contradiction that we live in, where we're in the period when supposedly we've all been declared equal and everything's been kind of fixed up. We've seen actually growing material inequality in the United States, right? The growing wealth and wage gaps, which are highly racialized and gendered, the dismantling of welfare, the attack on labor, all these things. We've seen hate crimes laws and anti-discrimination laws that supposedly protect us. They haven't resolved the conditions that we're concerned about, and those conditions have actually worsened, right? When you think about like access to people of color to health care, to housing, to all the sort of basics, you don't see that sort of stuff has been resolved. And more meaningfully, I think even beyond those things, the actual apparatuses of racialized and gendered violence in the United States have drastically grown during this period, right? So like the prison system has like quadrupled. All right, the United States imprisons more people than any country in the world, and in very violent, horrifying nightmarish conditions. Our immigration system is, Obama celebrates being the biggest, most deporting president of all time. More people are in immigration prisons than have ever been by, multiples. And of course, the significance of the project of war for profit by the United States is outrageous as we celebrate 10 years since the invasion of Iraq, and that's the war continues in Afghanistan, and the United States gears up for all kinds of horrible things in Iran, meanwhile engaging in these nightmarish sanctions. So weren't things supposed to get better, right? This is a dilemma for us as activists. And trans people specifically are encouraged that the way we should solve our problems, the problems I talked about at the beginning, poverty, homelessness, violence, etc., is that we should get hate crimes laws and anti-discrimination laws to include it. And that feels really unsatisfying, and part of my book is about is that, right? That, because we know that they haven't really worked, they haven't done what we hoped they would do, they definitely don't work for low-wage workers, they don't even cover places like prisons where the worst things are happening to us. And they don't apply in so many contexts where we work and live, and they don't, hate crimes laws, nobody can argue they prevent our deaths, right? They do nothing to prevent our deaths, they just punish people more, they add power to the same police and prison system that is our biggest perpetrator, right? So, one danger is that they won't really work, another danger is that they become window dressings for the actual conditions of our lives, right? So that those kinds of rhetorics become mobilized, like it's all been solved for you, stop complaining, this kind of stuff that is told to all people who are supposedly covered by these laws. And I think more concerning, they actually expand and legitimize the systems that harm us, right? When they add more, like when the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Act adds millions of dollars to local law enforcement, that's not actually a benefit to people of color, to people with disabilities, to queer trans people, right, in my opinion. So the other thing is that when we go for these kinds of, recognition-centered changes, what tends to happen is that narratives get mobilized about how the systems we're seeking recognition in or inclusion in are good. So suddenly it becomes like this pro-military rhetoric, when it's like, we want to serve. The military is suddenly a great job, not actually a horribly violent, terrible, racist, sexist place to work, right? Or the cops are our friends. We want hate crimes. The cops are not our friends. So we start to actually rehabilitate. We actually produce narratives. Marriage, I didn't say more. Right? We actually, produce like good, positive talking points about these actually horrible, nightmarish systems that our movement's been working for centuries to try to dismantle. We also end up mobilizing deserving and undeserving narratives about people in our communities, because you need to mobilize who's the hard worker, who's the taxpayer, who's the citizen who deserves the police protection, right? So you start to also create really divisive rhetoric about people inside, who's the deserving proper person who we can use as kind of a front person for this demand. And I think that, when Urvashi mentioned this kind of pinkwashing narrative, right, one of the things I think a lot of us are thinking about is how this kind of equality framework, it doesn't just fail to address the conditions in our lives, which is what our movements are supposed to be about, is actually reducing the harm we're facing and trying to extend our lives. But it's actually being mobilized to enable and support the very forms of violence and harm that our movements have developed to oppose, right? So we can see this very clearly in the recent developments in the Obama administration, the use of purportedly pro-gay talking points at the Democratic National Convention and his inauguration speech to try to portray himself as progressive, distracting from the brutal realities of his administration, right? The deportations, the failure to close Guantanamo, the development of drone warfare, the sanctions on Iran, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, not to mention being the president of the most imprisoning country in the world that has an apartheid system that we pretend has been resolved. We can see this in Hillary Clinton's famous gay rights or human rights speech, right, where suddenly she's portraying the United States as like a protector of LGBT people in order to justify military intervention around the world, right, saying let's bomb homophobic countries. Meanwhile, people in the United States who are queer and trans are rotting in prisons and immigration facilities that she's overseeing. And we can see it in the recent immigration reform framework. I'm sure you guys have followed this, where Obama's like this right-on dude because he wants gay couples to be in on the immigration reform thing. And what is that immigration reform thing? And what are all the immigration reform things that he's back? They're all about further criminalizing immigrants. If you really look at them, they're about expanding immigration enforcement, right? And they're about creating a faux path for a few deserving immigrants, meanwhile expanding the categories of those who can be excluded. So it's interesting to just watch how gay equality in various forms, and sometimes LGBT, although I really don't think they know what T means, and this move of using gay rights, which really just means, and also gay rights really in these contexts just means marriage and military, which I already think we need to think about, right? Because what are those rights? Using that sort of gay equality framework to justify and distract from growing, brutal, domestic and international violence is a state strategy people are calling pinkwashing, as Urvashi said, and that there's an upcoming amazing conference about here. And it's, I think, a useful term. It was developed specifically to talk about Israel's overt marketing campaign that aimed at portraying Israel as a human rights-loving protector of gay people in order to cover its outrageous, brutal treatment of Palestinians, including the theft of their lands and waters, and the enforcement of an apartheid system against them, right? So people use that term because Israel has a very traceable, very distinct marketing campaign saying, hey, we're this right on modern country in the Middle East, and look at all these horrible Islamic countries around us, and it's a very racist and Islamophobic framework. But the US and Israel, of course, are collaborating in this project. Both are obviously settler colonial nations whose legal systems are centered in colonial and racist principles and methods. And so legal equality in those contexts is, should be a really troubling concept for us, right? What does it mean to see recognition by and equality in apparatuses of militarism and racism as like a thing that's going to liberate us, right? So my book aims to try to help us ask some of these questions, laying out how some of the basic critiques of rights play out in trans resistance projects, and identifies 3 kinds of work that's being done now that I think of as like critical trans politics on the ground. Work to help people survive, work to dismantle systems that are forcing us into prisons and immigration facilities and deportation, et cetera, and work to build alternatives. So the survival work, a key thing about that is it's the work people are doing to try to like get someone housing right now, or try to prevent someone from being deported right now, or share food, or whatever it is. That work, people who are doing it in a critical trans politics framework are doing it in a mutual aid framework, not a charity or social work framework. And this is a really key piece about it. We can talk more about it, but the book is partly about this kind of critique of the nonprofit industrial complex that Urvashi alluded to around the ways in which helping work has been really depoliticized and been made to kind of keep systems in place. And there's other ways we can do mutual aid and solidarity work that isn't about disciplining people for needing help and pretending it's because there's something wrong with them, and individualizing it and deciding who's the deserving and undeserving poor. There are other frameworks. And so the survival work is that kind of work. A lot of the work I use as examples in the book are like work doing support for people who are in prison right now. That's really key work that's important to me. The dismantling work is all the work that's like trying to stop them from building a new prisoner jail in your town, trying to decriminalize stuff, trying to end 3 strikes laws, trying to like look at what really puts us into these systems and like take it apart brick by brick. Trying to decriminalize sex work. All of these pieces, right, are really central. And then the building alternatives work is the part of where it's like, okay, these systems aren't delivering anything that they promise they'll deliver. We do need those things. Like we need safety, we need healthy food, and we need ways of being together and ways of sharing. And so what does deliver that? So this is all the really inventive work people are doing to, find alternatives to calling the cops when things happen in your neighborhood, finding ways to prevent violence instead of just punish violence, and finding ways to create food systems that meaningfully help us, and all of those pieces of it, which there's many amazing examples of, many people in this room are engaged in. So the key to this is not that we never do work that involves law. Lots of kinds of work I just talked about do involve law. Of course, legal systems are like a giant problem for trans people and a huge source of our violence, and so we have to engage with them. The key is rather that we're not trying to be recognized by law or get the law to say good things about us. We're trying to figure out what legal systems are doing to us and change that, which is a very different project, right? So we don't believe what the law says about itself. When it says that we're all equal and we're great and everything's good, we don't care what it says about it. We care what it's doing to us. And so it's a very different set of objectives, and this relates to Urvashi's work. It's about, one of Urvashi's long-term critiques is what can the gay movement see as a gay issue? And so like welfare doesn't become a gay issue, or immigration is not a gay issue, right? This is the question, is like, what can be seen? How can we see that this is our issue and it doesn't have to have our name on it for us to realize this is actually what's devouring our communities? So we're trying to look closely at how our people are being harmed by legal and administrative systems and see ways to stop that harm and to get at the root causes of the conditions that are concerning us. Not because we think that any of our problems will be answered in law, because legal systems are one of the things we have to contend with, right? But that actually, I think a lot of us believe our problems are answered by our own mutual engagement and mutual aid.
Thank you both. You can see why, if you haven't already, you need to read both of these books. And they speak very well to each other, and I want to say that we're going to be taking questions from the audience, but I also encourage you, if you have questions for each other, if you want to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which your work has provoked each other, that would be great as well. One of the things, as you can probably tell from what they've said, that's really exciting to me about both of these books, is that they're both theoretical and practical. There are actually parts of these books that say, this is how we should do it, and this is what we should not do. And I think that that's really important and necessary, that it's not just the ideas, but it's also how they're put into practice. And so I want to, while people are getting their own questions together, get ready. I'm going to take the opportunity and ask the first question, and riff on, Dean, the way that you ended. So this is for both of you. I'm just going to throw out 3 things that are in the news today. So I heard them either on the radio or saw them on the internet today. And for you to talk about how LGBT politics or trans critical politics relate to one, you can pick one. So one of them is that The American Academy of Pediatrics today came out and said that gay marriage is in the best interest of children. The second is that this is the 10-year marker anniversary of the start of the Iraq War. And the third is that there is currently online a $50,000 campaign to raise money for Kate Bernstein's cancer treatment because she doesn't have health insurance. So I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about practically how some of the ideas that you've been working through in your books are related to these very practical things and how LGBT or trans critical politics actually affect one or more.
But, you know, the American Academy of Pediatrics report, we're in this moment where the marriage issue has taken over in part because, in large part, I think, because it makes us comprehensible to heterosexual people. And not necessarily comprehensible, it makes us legible. When we were sexual outlaws, when we were in relationships that people didn't understand, threesomes, serial non-monogamy, serial monogamy, living together with all of our ex-lovers in a group house, relationships that still continue. You know, my friend Amy Hoffman has a book called An Army of Ex-Lovers. And I really think of my community personally as an army of ex-lovers. And that is something that's not how heterosexuality lives. And sadly, I mean, to the detriment of many straight people's lives, their ex-relationships are always bitterly contested. There's divorce, there's trauma. Not to say that there isn't in gay relationships too. There is. I'm not like elevating this. I'm just saying there were and are differences, but those differences were not comprehensible to people like my parents. But marriage is. Oh, you want to get married? I understand that. That I can figure out. And okay, then you're just like me. And that's the narrative that's being promoted by large parts of our movement. The danger of it is that it's leaving out millions of different kinds of experiences and families that are part of queer communities and straight communities. Nancy Polikoff's book makes this point really, Beyond Gay and Straight Marriage. And lays out some of the kinds of policy issues that we could be dealing with if we were a movement for marriage plus. Now, you know, I'm not an anti-marriage person. You know, I'm for marriage plus in the policy realm. So that's my answer. I don't know if that's where you wanted me to go for the pediatric one. The 10-year Iraq War thing, George Bush should be in prison.
Yeah.
There are war criminals. The fact that we don't have a powerful enough progressive infrastructure to call for that is tragic.
People can't see that that's part of LGBT politics.
Well, I remember in the first Gulf War, opposing the first Gulf War when I was the executive director of the task force, and boy, did we get crap for that. That we lost donors, we had irate letters, I was pilloried for every name you name it, this isn't why we support the gay movement. But I think Dean's framework and the framework that's evolving out of queer politics today explains why we have to take on these larger systems and problems and projects that are damaging our lives. Back when I was doing it, I feel like an old fart, but truly, in 1991, I don't mean to sound like, back when I was, but I think the framework that I was using, and I still tend to end up using, is a little bit too liberal. And that is, well, it affects gay people, therefore we should care. And I think the framework that you offer is a bit deeper and more aimed at the root causes. These systems of policing and enforcement are coming from an apparatus that we have to dismantle. That's a really interesting critique versus we got to care about this because we're gay too. Okay. The third point about health insurance and cancer treatment, boy, I have been there. This is why my hair looks different from that picture. I just got through breast cancer treatment and I have health insurance. And if I didn't have health insurance, I'd be doing the fundraising drive that Kate is. So, universalizing healthcare insurance and lowering the costs has to continue to be a priority. The Affordable Care Act made a step forward. So, for example, when I leave my job that I have right now, in the middle of next summer, when the funding runs out for it, I'm leaving it, I will not have to fear that an insurance company can deny me because of pre-existing condition rule. That was my living fear, you know? I mean, they could still do it, but I'll fight, and they can't legally do it. But that doesn't answer the question. The problem is we still don't have a system, like a single-payer system. We don't have, a kind of universal health care that could address this. If this was happening to somebody in Canada or England, the stress that they would have to bear would be a lot different and a lot less.
I think I want to say about the marriage in the best interest of the children thing is one of the things that's so wild about watching a same-sex marriage advocacy is the ways that it uses directly anti-feminist talking points. So for like about a million years, we've been saying it's totally fucked up and anti-women, really, to say that it's in the best interest of children to like have a husband in that. I mean, like literally, like we've got welfare regulations that have, put this in place. I mean, and what I've been studying lately for some things I'm trying to write is what are the ways in which marriage actually, and the enforcement of marital norms is key to colonialism in the United States and anti-black racism. And so I learned about some of the history of the ways after Jim Crow officially, like after Brown v. Board of Education and Jim Crow was harder for states to enforce explicitly. One of the ways that they continued to keep black people out of certain services was legitimacy standards. And so there was all this litigation done by people who were trying to get at that. It was actually litigation about anti-black racism, explicit anti-black racism done through, engaged through these things that said you couldn't participate unless you had we were a legitimate child. Right? So just thinking about the ways that marriage has been explicitly enforced to exclude and harm, and not to mention the entire history of the mid-90s welfare reform that was literally, I don't know if you've gone back and looked at the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act findings lately, but it's welfare reform legislation, and the findings is literally 2 or 3 pages just about how the reason people are poor is because they don't get married enough, literally. This is a marriage promotion, it's a huge, yes, and Obama and Bush spend millions of dollars on marriage promotion where they pay women on welfare to get married. This myth, which is centrally an anti-black myth in the way it's spun by the media, but it's an anti-poor myth generally, that failure to marry makes people poor, is now a talking point by some same-sex marriage advocates, right? And so all of this is just wild to me. Not to mention I've also been trying to study the ways that marriage and family formation norms were enforced on people during the settlement of the United States. So the destruction of people living in long houses, the destruction of long houses, forcing people to live in nuclear families, right? Just that this form it's not a coincidence. It's not just because people love God they use this form, right? It's this, it's not just an ideological problem, it's actually a technology and a tool of colonialism and racism. And so there's so many reasons, it's easy to find second wave feminist reasons to hate marriage, and those are good enough for me. But there's so many complicated reasons why very many communities have fought against marriage enforcement in the United States. So it's interesting. I want to say one thing that is maybe everyone's audience will disagree with me on this. I actually am not interested in the imprisonment of George Bush and Cheney. Because I want there to be nobody in prison, and, which really actually challenges us. Then I have to go to how I feel about Bush and Cheney. And so that's really meaningful, because one of the things that these systems consistently do is when the contradictions in the system are too obvious, once in a while they put a cop in prison for killing somebody. But most of the time they don't. But when they do, it changes nothing about the reality that cops are going to keep killing people in our communities, right? And so that kind of I'm worried, even though I understand that call, but sometimes I get so frustrated with that being the call and the framework around war criminals, because really it's if it wasn't them, it'd be somebody else. What is it that causes us to live in a country in which we have the citizens of the country, nobody who lives in the country, nobody who lives in the land has any control over whether or not we go to war and whether or not we stay in it? That's the question for me, why is there no democracy? That's, you know what I mean? That's the concern. And then why does that country succeed in telling everyone that it's war making for democracy? So that, those are the things I want to kind of get at, and I want to always not make pro-prison arguments. And I think that the thing about Kate Bornstein and that kind of fundraising is this really brings us to how are we directly going to support each other? If we believe in dismantling systems that aren't working for us, we need to actually support each other all the time. Every single time there is an elder in our community, there is a person who's ill in our community, that, no matter whether we like them or not, and that's why I love the Army of Ex-Lovers framework. Because if Urvashi used to screw somebody, I care about them. Because this idea that our connections are beyond whether or not I like you right now, or whether or not I personally even knew, like, how can we create a level of care which is the reverse of capitalist, like fear, gotta get my savings account, gotta save it for me.
Privatized
Right.
family.
Yeah, what you write about, yeah.
And on that note, I encourage you to keep your questions brief so that we can get as many of them as possible. Comments and questions? Yes. Is that what you have with the hat? Yes.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Stand up and speak a little louder.
Thanks so much for this talk. This has been so rich. I'm going to have to try to keep it quick. This question for Dean, I really agree with the general argument you're laying out. I'm struggling with one part, and I'm just not sure how your argument accounts for the contradictory ways in which marginalized groups have engaged with the state. So, as you know, you're not only to pursue rights-based reform or strategies of legal recognition, see that kind of reform or recognition as an end into itself, and not everybody who does so has illusions about the state they're engaging with, or that those things equal liberation. You know, in our history is full of examples of people who have engaged in a really complex way with the state, especially ways that people have had to exploit antagonism within existing power structures. For example, you know, movements in the 1930s where particularly sharecroppers and domestic workers organized for federal anti-lynching legislation against, you know, local and state collusion between, you know, criminal justice system, police, and the Klan to enforce Jim Crow lynch law. And, you know, now we have communities who are experiencing spatial removal, domestic militarism, intense policing who are using language of human rights, not because they have illusions that that particular recognition is going to give them liberation, but because it's the goal at hand. And I would argue that even the civil rights movement was, you know, also a strategic engagement, not a certain kind of end into itself. So I'm just wondering about how, you know, like, whether your framework, I mean, how would you counter this kind of complex engagement, you know, which in a certain, you know, kind of reading could almost suggest that there's a naive engagement, rather than, you know, a kind of complex engagement the way that people are contending and using the tools of the state towards other ends, you know, towards other visions.
Can you repeat? Okay, don't repeat the whole thing, but just give us a little bit of a, we couldn't hear back here.
Oh, there are microphones, right? No? No. Well, just, you're going to have to shout. We'll repeat the questions.
It was a really great question about the ways in which marginalized groups actually are not naively engaging with rights strategies or legal recognition strategies. And some of the examples used were anti-lynching legislation work in the 1930s, civil rights movement, that actually it's a question about how people engage in a complex way with the awareness of the sort of pitfalls and how does that count in my framework.
So what I'll do is I'll take two more and then we'll kind of have a little bit of discussion.
I would ask if you would bring the discussion local to the upcoming mayoral election, and Speaker Christine Quinn, who when she addresses gay audiences tends to be cheered on by crowds excited about her marriage to her lawyer spouse, but seemingly oblivious to her other marriage to Michael Bloomberg. That she is single-handedly denying votes in the city council on fundamental issues like paid sick leave.
So I think most people heard that, a question about bringing the conversation local and talking about the mayoral election, and Christine Quinn, all the way in the back standing? Yeah.
You know, I just wanted to hear you all to kind of speak to these ideas around, you know, the gay movement being, you know, maybe very focused on marriage and you know, military involvement. I'm just really curious to hear about youth involvement and thinking about youth culture. So it's just like a general question, just thinking more about youth communities, and not just people who do youth organizing, but like youth actually organizing themselves, youth of color, queer youth. So like more of a youth focus on maybe some of the same topics we've already gone over.
Thank you. Question about youth involvement.
Okay.
Yeah, the first question, I'm sorry if I didn't do, you said it beautifully, so I'm sorry if I didn't do justice to the question. Yeah, I mean, I think that I hope that I'm not sounding like I think people are dupes for using the strategies. I actually think the strategies change all the time. So I think all I'm trying to observe in the book is a modest thing about how the specific argument that what trans people should be focused on is hate crimes laws and anti-discrimination laws, like how we can look at what we already know from critical race theory and from, like so many useful movement histories and say, how's that working out right now? How's that strategy progressed and changed? But I also think it's different in these different moments. But I'm also talking to a scholar recently telling you that some of the anti-lynching laws became actually the laws that are used to target terrorists now. So what's interesting is that state strategies are constantly moving and activist strategies are constantly moving. And so one of the dangers is that I think there is kind of and not by all activists, but just in a sort of cultural norm of just embrace of the concept of rights and recognition that I wish we didn't have to still talk about, but I feel like we do. I mean, I think there's this notion of this, that it is common sense. That, I mean, I've heard this rumor consistently, I think I might have heard some of it from you, that the next thing that the national gay orgs are going to take on, they're finally going to take on trans stuff so that trans people can serve in the military. And just that's a big deal. The fact that makes sense to these organizations is a really interesting thing. So to me, I think there's so much more complexity to how even individual local groups, how we deal with it. I was really fascinated to see how people were responding to the anti-marriage amendment in North Carolina in the last election. I thought there was really smart response to that, where an anti-racist, anti-poverty queer activists weren't ignoring that or saying, well, marriage isn't our top priority, so we're going to ignore it. They were actually trying to change the conversation using it. Or how, in the SRP's work, we fight for something that you could call Medicaid rights. And also I think Medicaid is a terrible system designed to kill poor people. And we fight for people to get into shelters, even though shelters shouldn't have to exist. So to me, it's not about saying that those are naive things to do. It's about figuring out how do smart activists decide how they do it. And this is a place where prison abolition has been really useful to me. Because one of the tenets of prison abolition is not that we do nothing until prisons are abolished, but instead that we ask each time we do something, is this going to enhance or expand the prison system? How might we feel about this in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? And that kind of modeling of how we think about what might be consequences of different reform strategies. And some scholars like Ruth D. Goldmore talked about it as how do we find non-reformist reforms? So how do we think about the dangers of reform strategies and then know that we still are going to use incremental strategies and that everything in some ways is a reform strategy. So, so that's I think that's what I'm really interested in is what does that look like right now in trans politics? And then also generally, I'm just fascinated by what does that look like for people? And also people disagree. Urvashi and I disagree on some sites of this in ways that are actually really interesting to me because we don't know the right answer. We actually don't know the consequences of certain reform strategies and even certain ways within reform strategies.
Like non-discrimination laws, we disagree on.
Yes,
and I think that they should be pursued, and that they're not an end. But they're a path to some other end.
Yeah,
but Dean thinks that they're kind of they expand and legitimize systems that harm us.
And I think that they're more complicated than hate crimes laws, which are just clearly terrible related. But I think that this kind of debate is what usually I think is going on inside activist movements that I study, historical ones and contemporary ones. I think that's the level of conversation we should be having. Is
I just wanted to add I thought the question was really great too, because I actually think within the LGBT mainstream movement, I do think many people are seeing this as an end, formal legal equality as the end point. I'll share a conversation that I relayed in the book, which was, I was sitting with a major philanthropist in the movement out west, and he said, when things are done in our state, when we get marriage equality or civil unions in our state, the work will be pretty much done. And then, and domestically in the state. And we had to have a discussion in which, I talked about all these other areas and populations and kinds of work and implementation even, and all of that wasn't going to be done. And at the end of the conversation, this person did get it. It wasn't that there was a hostility to seeing that. It was just a kind of an obliviousness that comes from buying this notion that equality politics promotes, that this is the be-all and end-all. That when we do win formal legal equality in these different arenas, the work of a social movement is done. So the other questions were about the local discussion of the mayoral election. And youth involvement. Yeah, so, the Chris Quinn thing, you and I may disagree on in the end, but I think that it is really troubling that the vote hasn't been held on the sick leave. And I do not understand it. And I think you've named it, that maybe it is the other person that she's having a relationship with. That may be the cause of that. And I do not understand that, because that person, Bloomberg, has done nothing but sabotage her again and again, and she lost a lot of ground by supporting the third term for that guy. And she lost a lot of support. A lot of us could not understand. The reason I think I may come down even in supporting her is I'm certainly not going to support Loda, James, whatever his name is, the guy who worked for Giuliani and who had his 15 minutes of fame in the last hurricane, and now we're supposed to elect him mayor. It's such a Giuliani move, It's like, right? Remember when he wanted to have a third term because he did such a good job during 9/11? And and then the other candidates definitely are wonderful progressive leaders. De Blasio, I think, is terrific. I think Bill Thompson has been there again and again on innumerable issues. I guess there's a way that Chris, I think you have to look at a whole record. And maybe you look at the record and say, this is a disastrous record. I do see a record of a leader who, strives to do the right thing for a number of populations in this city. And that's what we'd like in a mayor, but that's me. And again, I own my liberal reformist bullshit. Okay? I'm trapped inside this contradiction. So be kind to me, or be ruthless. But the youth organizing stuff, I do see that we have a movement that isn't just old, aging leadership. I think that what's exciting about the queer movement is that it is a movement of multi-generational leaders right now. I'm not sure that the multiple generations are in dialogue with each other or in engagement with each other. I think you've got, sage people on one track. I'll tell a story of intergenerational. When Dean and I met, I was working at the task force's think tank, the Policy Institute, and we wanted to do a project called a policy paper on aging, and it was called Outing Age, Public Policy Issues Affecting LGBT Seniors. And at that time, 1999, there was nothing like that. And, SAGE existed, and a couple other organizations existed that we reached out to, and OLOC, Old Lesbians Organizing for Change, existed. And I put Dean, who was an undergraduate at Barnard, in charge of that project. And I'll never forget Dean coming in and going, wait, you can tell your side of the story.
Those women really put me through, but eventually we bonded, but they were like, they did not trust me. They were like, you're 20.
You're 20 years old, you're talking to me, I'm in my 60s, what do you know? And then what happened was the brilliance of Dean is that Dean figured out that you came into the office one day and you said, I figured it out. It's the same systems. It's the systems that channel youth in a certain way and the systems that channel old people in a certain way, and we got to work on these systems. It was just brilliant. And the paper that came out of that thinking that Dean did was brilliant. So my answer to your question, which may not be the question you asked, is all about the importance of of being a multi-generational movement and mining that and taking advantage of that by having interesting conversations and confluences, because the world isn't constructed that way, to allow us to be in those multi-generational spaces. But your answer might be different.
Well, I'll say, it's interesting to me to see people kind of pushing on a lot of these issues in the realm of schools that are also happening everywhere, like the question of bullying and the mini hate crimes laws, which is the anti-bullying laws. It's the same logic. Like, let's punish people. Let's take what we know is already a system of racialized punishment inside schools and add more weaponry to it, which feels the same to me as adding more cops to the streets on the outside. So I've been noticing really amazing youth leadership on those kinds of questions, and also youth leadership in the immigration movement is so highly visible and so queer, which is really so I'm seeing a lot of that happening, and I do feel sometimes I really see the just splits. Like I feel like a lot of the stuff going on, the most paid staffed work is just, I think, seems pretty irrelevant to a lot of youth organizers who I encounter who are they frame not only their own identities really differently, but also what the key issues are. And I think it's going to be, I mean, I guess all movements have these kinds of dilemmas, and I think the answer to it is more intergenerational space. I don't necessarily see that always as a priority from those who have the resources to most facilitate that dialogue.
Right. The biggest intergenerational space is still creating change, right?
I see it more happening locally.
Yeah, yeah.
Like where I live in Seattle, there's like we're trying to stop a new youth jail from being built, and there's like people from like the queer youth space group involved in that, and there's like a youth gun bill happening. There's all this like interesting criminalization stuff happening that queer youth are doing really smart activism on. And I think for me, the most local spaces, people are fighting about resources and punishment and schools. And there's also a battle going on in Seattle about whether or not teachers will actually give the standardized tests in school. So all of these things are places where youth are being really amazing and mobilized, where I see queer youth learning the real skills we need for queer movements and all movements, and a lot of it's not like queer work. What'd you say?
And doing the work.
Yeah, and being really brilliant about it.
Yeah, and I would just add not being one-dimensional either, because part of this, the American Academy of Pediatrics thing and all of that is a lot of both straight youth who are raised by queer parents and queer youth themselves who are advocating for marriage equality and things like that. So, like anything else, it's not one-dimensional. We'll take a couple more questions and then we'll have some.
Can I say one more thing about that? I mean, I'll just say I was one of those young people I was put on the track to do marriage equality work. Like I was like a feminist high schooler, and you know, I grew up in welfare or whatever, and I was like politicized, and then I went to like college and found out about gay people, and then I was interested in that, and I interned at places like Lambda and NGLTF and stuff, and besides my wonderful experiences with Urvashi, I was like, what the fuck, it's 1996, and why aren't any of these groups doing anything about welfare? And you know, I just was having all these internal dilemmas, and I was also like doing projects on marriage equality in like the Hawaii case and stuff like that at these organizations, and it took a lot to get off that track. I had to like have jobs in gay bars and find out there was another alternative, and you know, but like that easily could not have happened to me. So I think there's also a dangerous leadership development framework that tells people to shed all their other experiences and wisdom and identities and get on this and become the spokespeople for this. And I've met a lot of other amazing queer organizers who in their early years were unwilling poster children, kind of, for things that they actually now think are really messed up and they feel really bad. And I think that's a dilemma inside of them.
Yes.
I'm an old, poor, white gay man.
Hello.
Hi, Jimmy.
My concern is that we are losing the right to be different without being labeled and recognized and contained, and what effect that has in the question of privacy, militarization, and security, about the apparatus being able to control, recognize, control, and contain. And the young generation has lost, at least I sense, or losing all sense of privacy because of new technologies. How does that impact on our sense, our right to be different and to organize?
Thank you. Sitting down.
I wanted to thank Dean for raising the issue about Hillary Clinton's rhetoric about the war often being for women's rights and queer rights, and it's really about war for profit. She hasn't really done shit on gay rights, and in particular also to raise the issue about how much worse queers are in Libya and Iraq and other places that used to have more secular governments.
With that, yes.
Thanks for speaking. This is exciting. In terms of rethinking practice, there's lots of looking back at HIV/AIDS activism from like the late 80s, early 90s, and I wonder if you guys want to just comment on that impulse, like where you think that's coming from, and then if you can, or if you want to talk about what can be learned from that, and what can be learned from current activism around HIV/AIDS, health justice, justice in Canada.
So, the relationship of differing understandings of privacy and the right to be different to LGBT folks today, and the relevance and the relationship of contemporary and earlier HIV/AIDS activism to what's happening today.
You know, I think that more than technology, the homogenization is coming from capitalism, which divides people into, it markets to us in niches and creates sectors and blocks, and that same strategy is being used in politics to create populations that are then marketed to by candidates. I hear your concern about privacy and technology. I worry about the surveillance apparatus of the state and the corporate state. I do. They know so much about me because of this and because of the computers. But at a certain level, I've kind of given it up. I think the way to contest that and to fight against that is, well, either be off the grid, which is nearly impossible, but other than that is to be fully public and militant in our publicity about the opposing that kind of social control. Being different in that space is still possible, maybe. The other, I don't know, Jimmy, if I'm answering your question. I think but that's my first answer. The rethinking practice around AIDS activism, what can be learned? That's a great question. And having lived through that, as a number of people in this room did, it's traumatizing, actually. And I think one of the things I notice about the movies, about ACT UP that are coming out, is, and then the kind of discussion that's been happening as we've lost a couple of people from that era, like Spencer Cox, and the discussion that came out after he died, has been really surfacing some of the issues that have been buried, which is the lingering trauma among gay men of a certain generation about the losses that we experienced. I mean, you know, post-traumatic stress syndrome gets covered around war veterans. We are in that kind of a community around the losses. They were massive and they were traumatizing and huge. So that's an emotional dimension that I think is interesting. In terms of the organizing strategies and what can be learned, you know, you think about it, there isn't that kind of a militant activist direct action movement. I think those come in, there are timing for those things, and it's hard to predict when that timing is. It was a life and death thing, and there's many life and death struggles going on, but there is a militant direct action movement around certain issues, around, you know, stop and frisk, around immigrant rights, around, so it's not a gay identified movement today necessarily, but it is a queer infiltrated and participatory movement. Lessons that can be learned, there are many. You know, I see the parallels between marriage activism and AIDS activism in many ways. AIDS took over the agenda of the mainstream movement in a lot of ways, and maybe it had to, in the way that marriage has. And it advanced visibility, it advanced relationships between gay people and straight people in the 80s. You know, we were, again, in a different world. And, you know, Reagan didn't say the word AIDS until 1987, you know, and didn't even utter it. You know, I protested the first George Bush, one and only speech on AIDS, and he didn't do squat, and that was in 1990. And I think the parallels are that that epidemic did something similar that I was describing that marriage does, right? It made us legible to a lot of people who had never thought of us as anything but perverts. And yet, it didn't change the healthcare system. We didn't really fundamentally, we changed some ways that drugs are developed, but we didn't change the corporatization of drug production, the subsidizing that happens at the federal government, private sector drugs, and then the marketing of those to, you know, for millions of dollars, the profit taking that happens. We didn't change as much as we thought we would, and I think that's going to happen with marriage too. We're going to win this right, and hopefully, although I don't trust the Supreme Court, and we're going to lose sight of these other issues. A big part of our movement is going to abandon the rest of the agenda. And I feel like that happened with AIDS too, especially after protease inhibitors.
Your question about privacy made me think about, it really made me think about the criminalization of sex and how, like, for me in that moment when I was, forming some kind of queer activist identity, Sex Panic was a group that I became involved in at that time, and we were like really looking at Giuliani's attacks on the Times Square area and the increased surveillance cameras in certain parks, and we were trying to articulate a queer politics that was a politics against policing of sex and against the crackdown on sex work. And I think that's really interesting in this whole period that we've been talking about today, this kind of sex offender registry, enhancement, the enhanced push around criminalization of HIV transmission that's ongoing. I mean, those conditions to me, I personally think that the concept of privacy is like not something that's ever really existed, and it's only ever really been existed for like a white property man with a fence. It's always been a lie, right? Like I said, people with disabilities have never been allowed to have privacy. Women have never had privacy, though. And privacy is also in a space about creating a condoned area of violence for domestic workers and women and et cetera, children. But I think that the way I think about this question is about the ways that the criminalization of sex has become normalized in whole new ways and is done supposedly in the names of women and children. And I think anybody else who's the human trafficking stuff is one of the versions of it that's really popular right now. So all these new ways constantly to criminalize sex and to criminalize people of color through the criminalization of sex and criminalize poor people through the criminalization of sex. And that is interesting to me because I think that we have to, I was thinking about that Gail Rubin thing where she got that diagram with the charm circle of sexual practices and the outer limits, and she says that whenever anything moves from the outer limits into the charm circle, it doesn't change the fact that there's two circles, and actually things get harsher for the people in the outer limits. And that's what marriage looks like to me, is that kind of, it's like, now everyone who doesn't have their life organized that way is even more of a pervert and more of a danger. And I think this relates to Ted's question about health activism, HIV activism, because to me, one of the places where I learned and continue to learn about doing the kind of activism that centers people who are most vulnerable and targeted instead of centering people who are most marketable is in the work people do to center drug users and sex workers inside HIV activism and inside variety of harm reduction activism, where we say that this life that is so marginalized is actually valuable and at the center, and we name that instead of being like, maybe we'll come back for you later, which has been the way that people have been treated inside the gay and lesbian rights frame for sure. I mean, trans people have been treated that way, people have been treated that way. So I think that those kind of fit together for me, and I want to thank Dawn for the question about Hillary Clinton, and also Dawn taught me how to use HTML. First we had to make a website a long time ago, and it was really helpful.
I just wanted to ask what you guys think about Drag Race. This wonderful TV show that has great stories and tells real human stories, but it's also sponsored by Absolute Vodka, and there's all this weird stuff that happens in this kind of capitalist but entertaining storytelling. So
a question about RuPaul's Drag Race.
There's been a lot of talk about electoral politics happening in the space, and so I'm just wondering if electoral politics are a further institutionalization of racist and capitalist hierarchy, then where do we go from there? Like, where do we go outside of reinstituting that system of electoral politics?
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, just two quick comments. First, I just want to caution, or ask to be specific, those films are about ACT UP New York. There was a really first national ACT UP movement tactically, population-wise, and I do think the global treatment activist militant movement that occurred later after the heyday of ACT UP New York did directly bring up a lot of issues about capitalism and expose the nature of drug development and pricing even more acutely, and has sort of wrecked, in some senses, some global markets and provided a bit of a, at least, buffer for delaying global trade squashing it. And then my question is, I have two, which is kind of like, if you could each give a kind of like quick workshopping, potential movement stuff. So one is, where is the movement related to what you were saying last about sex offenders, registry and all that? Like, where is that? Is it secretly somewhere and I can join it, or is it really not really there? And the second is, my movement, which is the HIV Prevention Justice Movement, is considering campaigns to fight for family acceptance programs to help families of all kinds, particularly those at the margins, to have some support and resources to support and love their queer and trans and gender variant kids instead of kicking them out. So what are some ideas, cautions, links on either or both of those topics? Thanks.
Okay, so I think maybe what we can do is expand the question about RuPaul's Drag Race perhaps to reality television in general and this idea of the marketability of the gay person, right? Because in reality television there's actually a very high percentage of queer folks in comparison to television in general and some other forms of representation. And then we had a question about where do we go outside of electoral politics given the problematics of that, and then asking for some ideas, which I imagine if you stay after mingle, you might get some other ideas too, but ideas from our speakers about families, support around families and around the sex offender registry.
I don't know anything about RuPaul's thing. I'm sorry.
Again, mingle afterwards. There's wine.
I betray my television watching history. I actually would make an argument for engagement in electoral politics. Again, continuing in my liberal reformist mode. And the reason for that is this. I think that there are opportunities at the local level for meaningful work to be done by city councils and county commissions and school boards and a progressive executive. Even, progressive can be in a range from left to moderate, right? A progressive executive, i.e. governor, mayor, local leader of some kind, has power to implement a lot of administrative policies and processes that really change the lived experience of people. And so I don't see why we would not engage in those processes. Now, obviously, I'm, saying this fully aware of the problems of campaign finance reform, and I have actually been involved with starting a lesbian PAC called LPAC, which everybody in this room can join for $1. I'm serious. There's no minimum. There's no maximum. but it's a lesbian super PAC that's all about trying to mobilize, the energies of LGBT women and the people who love them to get more attention and a voice in this mainstream sphere of electoral politics, in which at tables like these where I've sat in those rooms as a person working for somebody who's wealthy, I'm the only person marginally of some color in the space, and often the only woman to this day. So that's what motivated me to continue to create a vehicle with some other people to try to get more engagement. Electoral politics is problematic, but I've never been one of the leftists who disdained it. I feel like take it over, run it, bring it down. I'm serious, and that's my philosophy about organizations too. The nonprofit infrastructure, take it over, change it, bring it down, shut it down, if that's what we want to do. But you can do some work against it from the outside, but both outside and inside, take it over. The sex offender registry question, it's a really great question because it's a huge expanding arena of all the different kinds of sexuality and sex. That's being criminalized. And people are put into horrible double jeopardy conditions, where they've served time and then are still serving another kind of time and all these publicity about who they are and all that stuff. The only group that I know that's dealing with that right now is the ACLU. I don't see that as a big priority in the movement around politics, around opposing these kinds of frameworks when they're proposed in legislatures. And yeah. Maybe you can talk about family acceptance programs.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm really bad at TV. So and I'm also really afraid of any shows that have queer or trans characters movements because I feel so codependent and thinking about my foster parents or somebody watching them. So I just don't watch. I like avoid. I really only watch like the worst things that are not like that. And reality TV feels stressful to me too. Okay. So sorry. Electoral politics. I mean, I think that my feeling about all of our work is I never want to be absolutist. So I wouldn't say that we should never work on it. But I think what I feel is there's certain things that everybody seems to think are politics, and so there's all this stuff that people ignore that I'm most interested in, right? So I think for that reason I've never worked on electoral politics, and I think I probably never will. And I think that a lot of people I care about and know are like, that's not where the action is at for us because so many other things are being neglected, and because those strategies feel so incredibly compromising, and it seems like just, because of the campaign finance stuff, it just seems like a disaster, but I wouldn't rule it out that there could be. I think that there are people I really, really respect and movements I think are amazing that are doing lots of voting rights work. I think that makes a lot of sense and has been a very important move in a lot of moments in U.S. politics, and also there's people I know who are like, do believe that you should never vote, and I also understand what they're saying. I think that I don't feel an absolutist thing around it. It's kind of like, is there a really meaningful, important opportunity there? And in that realm, I often find there not to be in places I've happened to live or whatever. Which doesn't mean I want to ignore those people, but more that I want to just not put my energies towards electoral campaigns and things like that. But I think that this question about the sex offender, registries and how to build movements around that, what's really missing is general movements around decriminalization, because then it'd be easier for people to think about it. So this is the thing about this gun bill in Washington, right? Right now everybody's like, oh yeah, guns are terrible. And so it's a great time to it's a mandatory minimum sentence for juveniles who possess guns, right? So it's just amazing the ways that you can come up with new, with when mandatory minimums are kind of going out of vogue a little bit, people realize to put people in prison a little bit, but then you can use the gun hysteria. So I think the problem for me, and I've been noticing this because in Seattle where I live, there was a plan to build a new adult jail, and the big homeless newspaper organization got behind saying no, and the big public defender organization said no, and we all stopped this new adult jail from being built. Cool. And then they decided to build a new youth jail, and they say it's really good for youth and families. It's called the Center for Youth and Family Justice, and there's going to be social services, and all these people are totally into it. And they are just fundamentally not anti-criminalization. And when I go one by one to the people who work at all these organizations and say, what's the deal? Aren't you against criminalization? It turns out, no, they're not against criminalization. They're against that particular jail. And so, because of certain, so I think one of the things is how do we shift this conversation to a conversation with anti-criminalization? That way, no matter, even if you don't like guns, of course nobody wants kids running around with guns. It doesn't sound like great unless they're part of our movement. But, right, nobody wants, lots of terrible things to happen. It becomes, people have no background in place for an anti-criminalization framework. And so I think things like sex offender registries are so hard to fight. I mean, obviously people made, I think, a lot of work around the use of sex offender registries around New Orleans sex workers, in Louisiana. That got some attention. I just heard people in Chicago doing some work around sex offender registries. So I've heard little blips of people doing activism around it and seem to get some traction, but it's we need a broader anti-criminalization framework. It's just the most, people are the most deluded about that of all of the things that we're deluded about it. I mean, I think that's a question around, I want us to find ways to talk about making sure people are taken care of in our communities that doesn't only use a family framework, because sometimes that family framework, I see this a lot in the immigrant rights movement, it's actually, it undermines what Urvashi was talking about us trying to talk about really developing multiple ways to understand how we're connected and how we survive, and lots of us don't survive inside family frameworks. And also family means tons of things to people. So are there ways to support people in supporting all the youth in their community or supporting each other and getting over some stuff around queer and trans people that it doesn't totally hang it? And that's the same thing. I want to dismantle the child welfare system, which doesn't allow people who are not having things work inside their family, and it can't be fixed on a quick enough progression to get support from others. It's really, really hard for other adults and other young people to show up for them, and instead they end up in an institution. So I'm wondering if there are ways we can talk about it that doesn't overly hang on the notion of family, which is enforced in such harsh ways, but I really like the idea of having more of that work.
And yet, I do think that the family acceptance framework, I was really struck by Sarah Schulman's book, a couple of books back, she's done about 4 in the last 2 years, which is amazing, about familial homophobia and its consequences. Ties that bind, familial homophobia and its consequences. Because she's one of the only people who's written about the continuing nature of familial homophobia beyond the act of coming out. You know, you can be out and still experience all different kinds of familial homophobia. And her, so I appreciate any effort that's really trying to surface the challenge for HIV positive people or for queer people inside our families of origin. I think this is an issue that's hugely important to, you know, Indians and in the kind of family systems that we're raised in, and, you know, and among many communities, cultural communities, and, you know, and for all sorts of reasons. So I completely agree with Dean that I want a movement that honors the families of choice and these different complex families that we have, but somehow the only intervention that we've come up with around families is PFLAG. You know, and that's not getting at some of the things that I think you're trying to get at through the family acceptance work.
I have a question about, about centering anti-racism in movements and in talks or dialogues such as this. And my question is basically that I think that it was Dean who said something about marriage being a tool of colonialism. And I've witnessed and experienced going to talks such as one at Blue Stockings a couple weeks ago, where it feels like there's a lot of slippage between recognizing that something like marriage is a tool of colonialism versus just drawing connections and saying heterosexuals are enslaved to straightness. And for me, those are like, that's not an anti-racist assertion. And there's a very important distinction for me that I think can like kind of collude into each other. So I just wanted to ask how we address that.
I really enjoyed the presentation. I'm actually curious to see if we could share a little bit about what is the practices currently, the activism, as it regards people of color in getting not only the knowledge to speak as it regards admissions committee allowing them in, not only to say you can get in, but also we're sponsoring you to get in, because you're not really in until you're sponsored to get in. I kind of want to know what is the activism currently to shed light on that dark area. That's one. I also want to know, after the knowledge is acquired, what is done to ensure that the knowledge is disseminated to a wide spectrum of an audience, and disseminated in the sense that there are critics, reviewers, and literary spaces available that is interested in body people of color who are queer and the stories that they offer. Stories that are not always homogenous, but are different. Caribbean stories are different. Stories in Nigeria are different from stories in Ghana. Stories of the African American voice is different in Mississippi than it is in Alabama. I kind of want to know what activism is done within the mainstream white, among what mainstream white activists acknowledge all those various subjects.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, I want to say first, thank you for the experiences and the analysis that y'all are bringing, but also for the emotional tone that's being set in this space. I think I'm really grateful for it, and I think a lot of us are as well. I wanted to ask a question about, we'll just ask you to speak a little bit about disability, to think about, one, what we can learn from the disability justice movement, and its understanding of the limits of rights-based models of inclusion. One, two, thinking about care, which has been kind of commented on a couple of times, thinking about how the economies of care that we have in this nation today are predominantly staffed by undocumented women of color, and the very real structural intersections between disability, illness, and undocumented women of color, for example, and where might queerness and where might this movement kind of be articulated in that. And three, to think about, y'all talked a little bit about relationships and alternative models of relationships, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you might understand like interdependence or different things that are coming out of the disability justice movement as being helpful when thinking about different ways of being in relation to each other.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got centering anti-racism in queer conversations. We have a question about people of color activism within the mainstream white movement and the dissemination of knowledge. And then we've got a question about disability justice work and how that work and the economies of care related to that work interact with
Age before beauty. Okay, you know, I argue that in fact the mainstream movement doesn't center on an anti-racist frame, and so I'm not surprised that you would find situations in which you're hearing speakers talk where the framework isn't precise or referenced. And I think that the kind of politics around race that I describe in the queer movement, mainstream movement, is pretty much a politics that's about diversity, as opposed to a deeper politics around thinking about colonialism or the sort of institutionalization of racism in the structures of decision-making in organizations, or the structures of, the way a community is seen or not seen, whose voice is heard and whose voice is not heard. And there's a muteness about race in the movement, mainstream movement's politics, in the sense that you don't hear the leaders of the mainstream movement talking about it the way Dean does, with the specificity of, criminal, this is what's going on for these populations, this is what's going on, this is how the police are being used, right? There's this kind of myth of colorblindness and post-racialism that's bought into, I think, by many in the movement. We're beyond that, we're, the black president, the whole thing. Post-racial, and post-racial is such an erasure of histories of racism and colonialism. And then there's this kind of glossing over of race and a focus on class. It's really class, not race, which is another way of not dealing with racism. So I think those are 3 examples that I see of the discussion. In terms of POC communities, or the way, that's a great set of questions and concerns that you raised too. And I think that there are tons of queer people of color organizing and creating art and creating work in all different kinds of organizations. But you wouldn't know it from the inside of many of the organizations that we have. And I think, one of the things I tried to do in the different institutional roles that I've held is to strengthen and support the leadership of queers of color in different ways. And so now you see, but I'll give you another statistic. When you look at 40 years of queer funding, there's a report that came out from Funders for Lesbian and Gay Issues, looking at 40 years of funding of LGBT projects by foundations, formal, organized, philanthropic, charitable foundations. About 8% of that work went to people of color. And in 40 years, we're talking about $770 million, almost $1 billion, $750 million. And so there's a real gap in investment in the work that people are doing. The work is happening, and people are investing it in themselves. I was thinking when your question came up about the different voices and the different, how you address that. I don't know that the mainstream movement addresses that. In communities of color, there's specificity. So, for example, the National Queer API group, network, National Queer KPI, is conscious of the differences within Asian identities, for example. and trying to give voice and perspective to different identities. I was thinking about the work that you're doing, and you might want to talk about how it's being addressed in the conference that you're producing in Ghana, which people may not know about. So, I thought that might, didn't you hear that, that question?
Yeah. We'll just also in the ethics of care, we'll give our speakers a moment to take a drink of water. Yes, I mean, your question was mostly geared towards the mainstream white movement, but to speak about the other side, there's a lot of work that's happening outside of this country, which is a lot of what I'm invested in interacting with. There's CFLAG in the Caribbean, there's the Coalition of African Lesbians, there's a lot of work happening, and some of it is visible and some of it is being funded by places like Australia, and some of it is invisible, and some of it needs to be invisible, and some of it is invisible to people who don't know how to see it. Right, so a lot of the organizations within the Caribbean, within the Caribbean, there's not the tradition of identity politics that there is in this country. And so when people from North America and Europe, they say, well, they're not gay enough, basically. You need to be gay the way we're gay. You need to call yourself gay and lesbian. You need to call yourself queer, and you need to work with anti-criminalization efforts and do a particular kind of activism. Whereas in the Caribbean in general, that's not the kind of activism that has happened. Right? The major activist movements in the Caribbean have been anti-slavery abolition movements, nationalist movements, and Caribbean feminism. Right? And so you have a lot of sexual minorities within the region who are saying, not we want things because we're different, but we want things because we are actually part of you. It's a fundamentally different approach. And even the names of the organization, the coalition advocating for the inclusion of sexual orientation in Trinidad, CAISO, SASOD, the society advocating for sexual orientation, I'm forgetting the last word, in Guyana, they don't have LGBT in the title. So it's fundamentally different, and then it doesn't show up. If you Google LGBT Caribbean, some of those organizations are not even going to show up, right? And also in terms of dissemination, a lot of stuff is happening on the internet, right? None on record, in terms of stories of queer Africa, oral histories of people from the African continent telling their stories. Of course, not everybody in Africa has bandwidth to access that. So again, but there's a lot of different things happening. So I really just want to argue for understanding that you generally, any of us, can't necessarily see what sexual minority activism looks like in another place. And that a lot of that activism is happening outside of the so-called white mainstream and actually needs to. So.
I just want to say about the first question, I think that one of the really painful things about the white gay discourse is the ways that it picks up really problematic analogies to anti-white racism, and so it's used a lot of second-class citizen, it's used Lawrence and R. Brown versus Board of Education, and various phrases that have been critiqued by many people, and the words like gay is the new black. I mean, these kinds of frameworks rely on erasing anti-black racism, either pretending it's over or pretending it's so mundane that everyone knows what it is and it doesn't need to be analyzed, and only homophobia needs to be analyzed. And that the slavery analogy, I think, is a common problem. And this activist I really admire in DC, Darby Hickey, who does anti-criminalization of sex work activism and trans activism, she's actually writing right now about the ways that anti-human trafficking stuff uses this slavery analogy, and I think it's really important because it's, of course, it's a movement to criminalize people, which will intensely criminalize immigrants and people of color, including black people. So what does it mean to kind of use a slavery analogy to forward that work that we might say, many would say, is actually corollary or connected to systems of slavery? I'll just go to the disability question. I think that the disability justice movement has been really, really, really significant inspiration for me in thinking both about disability in my own work and also in thinking about another location of a critique of a rights framework. I think it's interesting to put disability justice and disability rights and reproductive justice and reproductive rights and then these two different kinds of models of queer and trans activism we're talking about all into a conversation and see because different politics and populations highlight different limitations of the rights framework. But one of the things I think is really noticeable is that the rights framework that's being used in the gay and lesbian politics context is based on these kind of organizational structures that Urvashi's talking about, that we're literally a bunch of white men at Urvashi meeting in the back room and decide what the agenda is going to be. I mean, literally, right? You've been in this position a lot of being sort of only person, whatever, and meritocratic, and it's based on the only things it values are big court wins and maybe like a few certain big media stories. And anti-racist, anti-colonial activism, and definitely disability justice activism is based on a completely different set of values about what it means to win. It's about relationships, it's about building our own capacities to survive what's going on right now and to build shared analysis with as many people as possible instead of like just a few people who are going to be at the top and are going to be the ones who graduate from Harvard and should run the movement, which doesn't work for anybody. We can't, as you were talking about, we can't even be admitted to those spaces of elitism. And so it's, for me, one of the things the disability justice movement does is it also really helps us think about what are our actual activist spaces like, who can come to them, what ways of knowing and communicating can be heard in them. And what I found is that even really left interesting organizations have really ableist norms inside a lot of our movement spaces. And so that's a deep challenge for us. And the other thing for me is like coming from a perspective of trans politics and a perspective of trying to work around access and people to healthcare. Disability justice also helps us think about not just trying to get access to the healthcare system, but really what the fuck the healthcare system is, right? And whether or not we right, since it's a diagnostic, heavily labeling, it decides what forms of life can be cultivated and what must be extinguished. It's deeply eugenicist, right? And that's what medicine is. And so what we really want is to change we want to get rid of norms that say what is a healthy body and mind. And we want everyone to be able to access whatever technologies of medicine they want, instead of trying to say, like, let's all get insurance to be in the current system that sucks and like denies lots of ways of being and certain lives and all this kind of stuff. So it's a very different framework, and I think a lot of issues that people on the left think they know what they think about, they haven't thought about through disability justice. I think one example is like people who ending life, right? Like when I found out from this amazing trans disability justice activist, Eli Clare, that there's an organization called Not Dead Yet that does all this work about how it's primarily disproportionately women of color whose lives are ended early. I was like, wow, we need to rethink this. I need to have a more complex politics about this, not because people shouldn't be able to choose to end their lives, but because the way it's being framed completely misses a race analysis, completely misses a disability justice analysis. So for me, that's all been really useful. For me, disability justice helps me think more closely about how state norms that I'm concerned about and systems of population management that I'm concerned about, how our health norms and even stories that movements tell about being healthy people and about being the right kind of standardized person already making certain lives like impossible, invisible, or extinguished. And that's been a really useful sort of set of frames for me. I think there's a lot more I want to be learning in that, including an interdependence frame. I mean, it's like, how can we have anti-capitalism without having a disability justice interdependence frame? We desperately need that, and it's often missed, I think.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering after Rosamond gave that analysis, because to me, unlike what Urvashi said, in the HIV/AIDS movement, in fact, race and class emerged very centrally for a long time within ACT UP and other kind of grassroots groups, not so much the service agencies. And like in ACT UP in both Boston and New York and probably other cities, the split was between the treatment action group and the people who wanted to stay focused on the complexities of race and class within the epidemic and within the discussion of sexuality and gender and et cetera. So I was wondering if, and with, and the film goes with the treatment action, and it has literally 1 minute mentioning the split. And that's it in that long film. And in Boston, simultaneously, just before that, we had the whole foster care fight, which again was a split among, quote unquote, lesbians and gays over whether or not a white picket fence and white, rich, gay boys taking care in being foster parents to African American children was in fact superior to the mother, who was poor and needed to be taken care of in all these other ways. And so this whole discussion evolves and erupts and people mobilize around it. So you really have these long moments in which race, class, gender, sexuality are all in dialogue and happening, and it loses. The hegemony of the kind of narrow identity politics reemerges, flushes out all the complexity, and we're back to the rich white man running the show. And you take something, and for you, or the community center becoming absolutely brainless, So brainless that banning Sarah Schulman made sense to them. You know, so is in fact what you're talking about a challenge within the so-called West, we'll say, the US, Canada, now Israel, a little bit in some parts of Europe, to break those terms of identity politics in order for the complexity and the discussion to happen as people experience in the communities. I know it's a huge fight in Mexico, so, you know, I'm sure it's happening all over the place, but I just would like to know what you guys think.
Thank you. About that. The glasses? Yes.
Hi. So I also really appreciate the conversation and the amount of questions that are taken up the space. I'm also interested in the way that young people came up, but it came up in sort of a way where we're talking about intergenerational organizing, and I'm more interested in why it's so difficult to talk about education and young people within the LGBT national state-run movement, and also in a queer, critical trans, critical movement as well. Like we talk about, we want to dismantle the welfare system, we want to dismantle the foster care system, and we want to dismantle all these things that approach talking about young people. Or we talk about marriage and how that approaches talking about young people, or the military where young people are filtered into. We don't talk about schools and what's going on in them. And I'm wondering why it's so difficult. And I think of someone like Lee Edelman who talks about a child being deeply threatening to the LGBT movement or to a queer movement in the way that it holds all these reproductive structures that we sort of want to dismantle. So I'm wondering how we could potentially approach education or school as an institution like policing, like healthcare, like welfare that we need to talk about, and why it's so difficult right now to commensurate those two, that institution and the politics that I think a lot of us are kind of on board with.
Okay, so I think a question about challenging identity politics and a question about really integrating youth in education.
I'm trying to think. On the education one, I think, I mean, we didn't discuss the whole GLSEN gay-straight alliance nexus of work, which is huge. And you're absolutely right to point that out, that that's an enormous site of activism right now by young people. I don't know that it's getting that activism, I mean, I don't know, maybe you can speak to it more knowledgeably than I can, but I've always wondered how connected that activism is to the kind of defunding of schools and the whole way that the nature of public education is being redefined right around us, right? Into these charter schools or other schools that are now promoted as better vehicles for providing education, right? So that's one piece of it. The other thing that I know people are working on is a school-to-prison pipeline stuff. And I'm sure Dean can talk really knowledgeably about that. So there is a lot of activism going on. The complexity of why it's hard for queers to work on youth issues, I tell you what, with the Catholic Church and its sex scandals, it's become easier for queers to talk about youth issues, hasn't it? What I'm referencing is that when I came up, it was a real, like we were, keep the gays away from the kids, was the thing. And over the last 30 years, things have changed. There's tons of gay parents with kids who are out about it. There's, tons of stuff that's happening, and it's become also clear, although in my view, there's not enough still activism around it, is that the sexual abuse is happening in these private spaces, as Dean referenced earlier, the way private zones of family and church and these, schools that are reform schools and so on, is that in situations where there's power dynamics that are being exploited. And so I don't know if that's what you were referencing, but I'll surface that, as maybe that's what I heard as to why is it so hard. You kept asking why is it so hard for the movement to talk about young people. I think it's changed, is my answer. The whole question about identity politics, Marla, why I was pausing is that the glib answer would be to say, identity politics is a necessary mistake, which is what I said in Virtual Equality. But I still believe that it's problematic to me. The thing that I think that's necessary, that's needed right now, I don't know if the question that I'm struggling with is, do we work through identity or not? Or do we have a politics or not? The question that I'm struggling with is, how do we network the different kinds of people who are working together around race, class, gender, sexuality in a different relationship with each other so that we actually either dismantle certain institutions and systems, or in my frame, win political power or the power to run those institutions and systems in different ways. And so I'm not going to answer the question you asked, other than to acknowledge that it's a great question. I don't think the problem is identity, because I don't think we'll ever get rid of identity. Identity matters to people. Identity matters, and maybe one of the ways I'm trying to think about identity is through this notion of tradition and the idea of norms and how tradition and notions of tradition are these inherited notions of the past that we carry forward into the present, that are meaningful to us and that give meaning to our senses of self and family and life. And I think it's too difficult for me to imagine getting rid of it. Instead, I imagine building a politics that networks people, despite their identities.
On the first question, I think one of the things that made me think about was just the concept of infighting amongst activists. And to me, infighting is it's always disparaged, but actually it usually means that we're lively and pissed off about what's the right thing to do and what's important, and people are usually standing up. The great way to end infighting is to just have white rich gays run everything. It's this sort of peace that comes from total domination. So I feel and oftentimes people like us are oh, you're a pain in the ass, you're infighting and making your identity an issue, whatever. So I think it's interesting. It just made me think about that, your story about being inside groups that are torn up, and every group I've ever been in that split, it was really meaningful that it split, and there's room for more, So I
agree, splits are good.
I think it can be useful. So I just want to say that, and I also think with identity politics, for me, identity politics are also so disparaged. But I guess what I find is, we all have lots of identities, we're part of different institutions, we're part of different regional communities, we have different, lots of things to identify us. And whatever it is that gets people fired up and they're pissed about right then is useful. So, you know what I mean? So people come and work inside SRLP, they're pissed about a lot of different things, but oftentimes they also need a place where they can be trans and be pissed. And they tried to go to some other spaces and be pissed, and they were kicked out for being trans, or, whatever. So there's a lot of reasons people come and organize around certain identities at certain times. And it's not their only way of organizing, but I feel there's no, your identity as a trans person, a queer person, or a woman, or whatever it is organizing is not any less important than identity as a worker or a student. And I feel a lot of times we say that identity politics is only when it's disability, race, gender. So I don't know, there's something about that.
Yeah, Christian identity politics is the biggest identity politics around.
Yeah, true. And then I should also want to
2,000-year-old identity movement.
Not to mention Zionism. Okay, so I also want to just say that this question that Rosamond brought up too about this kind of framework around thinking about queer politics globally is really important to me, because one thing I see happening is that a lot of the rich white gay people who have funded some of the domestic work are now I want to fund international stuff. And they really want to do it in an imperialist way. I think there's a really intense thing going on where it's the cool hot thing now is going to find the oppressed gays in other countries. I mean, this is deep. And I've heard pushback from people in Latin America and the Caribbean specifically about that. People, this kind of enforcement you need to do the set of legal reforms that we've found to work, even though they don't work, in wherever the donor is coming from. And I think that is a question that's really, it's how do we produce this? And it's the same as the women's saving stuff. I mean, it's the same framework. And the last thing on the schools and education, I think that the way that I see people working is in SRLP, a lot of our work, a huge number of our clients are youth, and a lot of people organizing SRLP have been talking primarily about foster care and juvenile punishment, because a lot of them have left school or have a harder time staying in school. But also we've had people who are fighting about that, about being kicked out of school for being trans and things like that. And one of the things I'm noticing as some of my favorite activist frameworks around this is just being real about what school is, which is horrifying social control, an apparatus of racialized violence, all these things. And And so the kind of like the way that the left can sometimes be like, schools, not jails, and it's like, well, given the school to prison pipeline, given the mental sectors, given the precinct inside some people's schools, how can we be thoughtful about this? And I'm really inspired by organizations like Fierce that have political education programs for young people. That's like, what can you not get in school that you actually need to be a leader in movement and to survive? And so I'm interested in that, like how can we both intervene on schools and also be part of autonomous projects that are not part of the school. I mean, I think that that's key to do both things and have people inside the schools helping people get to these other kinds of projects where we can ask different questions in be different ways. Because I think that's like key, and we have to understand like youth issues and youth organizing as it's never just the school. It's also the child welfare system that they're being exposed to. It's also the group homes. These things, these institutions are connected. Oftentimes, you're going to school inside a juvenile punishment facility. And so, I don't know. I think that's I'm trying to think about those things in a connected way.
Well, I want to thank Dean and Urvashi who've been so generous with their
when I sat with them. So I've got to tell you about the last hour and a half since we've been here. Because, well, first of all, the police showed up. And literally said, I know, right? And wanted to kick everybody out. And I was like, look, there are white people in there. And you know how y'all get. So then once that got resolved, we wouldn't let anybody else in. And so if you look around, just look around the room. And in addition to this, the folk on the floor and everything else, we had to turn away about 30 people because they literally weren't letting them in anymore, which I think is a great, wonderful thing. But fortunately, we're videotaping it, so it'll be online, etc. And then, of course, there's a reception we have upstairs, yes, installed. And because of the reception we have upstairs, because they delivered the food to the wrong building. Then we went on tour looking for the food. We found the food. And they did deliver it to this building. They delivered it to the mailroom. And 2 boxes. And they locked the mailroom and went home. Exactly. Yes. I couldn't write this shit. Not that creative. We got keys, which is helpful, okay? And so now the food is indeed being relocated back upstairs to the 6th floor, 161, 1, and 2. And we're also going to have wine there, but again, it's because there are more people here than we expected, but still enough food. So, so you're probably thinking to yourselves, what are you going to do for the next 15 minutes or 20 minutes or so? What I suggest you do is purchase first Nourish's book. For a mere $20, Irresistible Revolution, Confronting Race, Class, and the Assumption of LGBT Politics by Urvashi Vaid, right outside the door. And then, as soon as you do purchasing Urvashi's book, and then have her sign it, all of them, slowly. And then, once that's done, you can purchase Dean's book for $16, and I believe half of it goes to Sylvia Rivera.
If you give 20, $4 goes to Sylvia Rivera Law Project.
Oh, there you go. Yes, that's great. That's for Urvashi's book. Now, for Dean's book, okay, for his book, Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and Limits, and the Limits of Law, excuse me, I can't read. Again, right outside, you can purchase these books for $16, for $20. Please, I encourage you to do so. And one last thing, once again, please give a hand to this brilliant
So before you leave, you can also just introduce yourself to the people around you because that's part of the networking and the coalition politics that they've been talking about.
That's a great idea. In fact, before you get up, turn to the person right next to you or behind you that you don't know and say who you are and what kind of work you're doing.